Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, I love when I get an opportunity to dive into a topic that I know really, really well. And this is right in my wheelhouse. One of my favorite subjects of study over the last 10 years or so has been the Wars of the Roses in British medieval history. And this is right at the tail end of that. In fact, some people use this king as the marker to delineate the end of the medieval period in the what is now the United Kingdom. So today we're diving into extra history and Richard III in their historical Tyrants series. Now, unlike some of the other tyrants that they've covered, there's a lot of debate about this particular guy and whether he really was a tyrant or if that's really Tudor mythology. So we're going to dive into some of that today. I've had the chance to visit Richard III's grave in Leicester in central England. I've been to the Bosworth battlefield. I've been to the site where Richard was killed, which isn't really on the Bosworth battlefield, at least not the part that you visit. It's in another area, but fascinating story. So I'll put the link in the description as always. You can check it out without my commentary. Definitely head over and give a like to Extra History, one of my favorite content creators to do reactions to. So let's dive into this topic.
August 22nd, 1485, near Market Bosworth, England. In the midst of battle, two royal retinues clash, resplendent in their plate armor and their bright surcoats displaying their heraldry. One fights beneath the standard of the White Boar, the crest of Richard III.
So what's cool about this too is that they've actually found on the battlefield like little white boars, which was, you know, something that they were all wearing. Just fascinating little details like that.
The other, the Red Dragon of Henry Tudor. Both rivals are battling to rule England, but only one will live to see the setting sun. Amidst the fray, Richard cuts his way toward Henry. He initiated this particular melee, determined to engage and slay his rival in personal combat. But just before he can reach his nemesis, crashing into the combatants, a new force arrives. Lord Stanley, who has sworn on separate occasions to fight for both Richard and Henry, has finally joined the battle.
And Richard is actually holding Lord Stanley's son as a hostage during this battle to guarantee that he will fight on his side. I mean, this is very much an inspiration for the Battle of the Bastards in Game of Thrones, where you have the battle happening and then, you know, the army of the Vale shows up at the last minute and charges in and turns the tide. That's kind of what happens with the Stanleys, except they were kind of sitting on the sidelines the whole time.
But hold up a minute. Just whose side are Stanley and his men-at-arms really on? Well, the civil war that has raged across England for the past 3 decades is about to be decided, and with it, the fate of a tyrant. But before we continue, if you love Extra History, then a great way to support us is by picking up our new 2026 History Happens Everyday calendar over in our merch store. But more on this after the episode. Ooh. Say, I bet when you enrolled at the Tyrant Scene Investigation Academy, you didn't expect you'd be digging dead medieval kings out of car parks, huh, kid? All right, enough dilly-dallying. Let's see what's under the hood. Classic parking lot.
Yeah, if you haven't already followed the story of how they found the body of Richard III, like 10 or so years ago, 10, 12 years ago, in Leicester, under what they call a car park, what we would call a parking lot here in the States, totally worth your time. Go to YouTube and check out, like, there's a full documentary video about the process. It's amazing.
Butt joke. Subject is Richard III, the last Plantagenet king of England. Date of reign, June 26th, 1483 to August 22nd, 1485.
Unless you ask Henry Tudor, he would say that the reign ended on August 21st, because after Henry Tudor wins the Battle of Bosworth, he has Parliament backdate his reign to the day before the battle so that he can argue that anybody that was fighting with Richard III was actually fighting against the rightful king. It's propaganda 100%.
Whew, just under 2 years and 2 months. Okay, so right about now, rookie, you might be getting cold feet about this case, because depending on who you've questioned, you might have heard that this Richard was a good king killed while fighting a usurper, and that later writers cruelly blackened his name. After all, history is written by the victors. But if we bring up that profile, we also have to mention the alternative. that Richard was a manipulator who oversaw the murder of women and children in his quest to seize and hold the crown.
So I will say this, that even if we take the view, which I think is a very reasonable view to have, even if you take away the death of the princes in the tower, his nephews, which I know we're going to get into, even if you take that off the table, there's still plenty of very concrete evidence that Richard did some pretty shady things in his pursuit of the crown and holding on to the crown. But I'm not sure that those other things make him any more diabolical, any more of a tyrant than any of the other monarchs over time.
And if you believe that, he very much fits the tyrant profile we've been building. Of course, it's tempting to imagine reality lies somewhere between the two extremes of good King Richard and the Machiavellian villain that Shakespeare said could, quote, frame his face to all occasions. But really, where on that sliding scale does he lie? How much of the real man can we untangle from the myth? Well, Richard was born in England in 1452. 3 years prior to the outbreak of a 3-decade-long civil war that would later be known as the Wars of the Roses.
That's a great point, that it would later be known as that. It wasn't like they thought of it as that at the time. They weren't like all going around wearing white roses and red roses, you know, the white rose of York and the red rose of Lancaster. That's really kind of something we've built up more over time since then.
Richard would end up as the lead character in the war's final chapter. He was the 4th surviving son of a powerful English nobleman, Richard, Duke of York, and his upbringing, indeed his whole life, was defined by politicking and conflict.
So I don't want to get too far into this. We've done other videos about this topic, but long story short, all of it goes back to what happens at the end of the 14th century. You have King Edward III, and he has created all of these powerful royal dukes, right, among his sons. And this kind of lays the groundwork for this. And then the next thing that happens is that he dies just after his eldest son, the Prince of Wales, the one we know as the Black Prince, dies, which means the throne passes to Edward's grandson, who was just a kid at the time, who's Richard II, who's the son of the Black Prince. Richard II starts out okay, but ends up being a bit of a tyrant himself, and eventually is usurped by his cousin known as Henry Bolingbroke, who becomes Henry IV, and he's the beginning of the House of Lancaster. And so Henry Bolingbroke, has the throne. His son Henry V becomes king, very famous king, very highly regarded king who wins the Battle of Agincourt, is able to claim the throne of France, but then he dies in his 30s and leaves the throne to his infant Henry VI, infant son. Henry VI, anytime you have children, we see that over and over again. Children inherit the throne. Bad things tend to happen because powerful adults try to wield authority. Eventually, Henry VI is seen to have a mental illness of his own, and that leads to another crisis. And eventually, Richard, the Duke of York, who really has a stronger claim to the throne than Henry VI does anyway, eventually, through a series of things that happen, first just wants influence, wants power, but then eventually claims the throne for himself. He's killed in battle during the early stages of the Wars of the Roses, and so then his son, who's going to become Edward IV, takes on the mantle of the Yorkist claim, and that Edward IV is the older brother of Richard III.
The Wars of the Roses stemmed from the thorny issue of a dynastic struggle between two of the most powerful noble families in England, the House of York and the House of Lancaster. The reigning king at the time, Henry VI, belonged to the House of Lancaster.
And I even waited to see if they were going to cover this, and it seemed like they were already moving on from the sources, so that's why I said so much about it.
But he was mentally frail and easily manipulated. Richard of York, Richard III's father, sought to seize the crown in the mid-1450s. After 5 years of intermittent civil war, Richard Sr. was killed, but his other...
In a really stupid move. He's held up in this castle, and he's well protected, and he's in good shape, and he rides out of the castle for some unknown reason and gets himself defeated and killed.
Her son Edward, Richard Jr.'s eldest brother, that's not complicated at all, continued the struggle and was ultimately crowned Edward IV after successfully deposing Henry. However, Lancastrian resistance continued.
And Henry VI is still alive at this time, right? He doesn't, Edward IV doesn't kill Henry VI. Henry VI, I don't think, really wants the crown all that much anyway. It's more his wife, Margaret of Anjou, who is the real power behind kind of keeping this going.
You still following, kid? All right, good. Because these roots are going to get a whole lot more tangled. This is the true story Game of Thrones was based on, after all. As the
Lannister, Lancaster, Stark, and York, yeah.
Younger brother of the Yorkist king, Richard was heavily involved in the conflict. When the fortunes of the White Rose of York wilted, he spent time in the Low Countries. But when the rose went into full bankable bloom, he went back to England, assuming important royal and military titles at a young age. Despite developing spinal scoliosis during his early adolescence, he fought directly against the Lancastrians.
So this is a good point. We know now that he had some pretty severe scoliosis, but for a long time, this was one of the debates, right? This was a debate where the Ricardians, as they're known, people who tend to view Richard III in a favorable way, said, "Oh no, that's Tudor propaganda. The House of Tudor, under like Elizabeth." Is having Shakespeare write this stuff and making him sound like he's a hunchback. There was really nothing wrong with him. We know Richard was a great warrior and fought bravely, but was a little on the kind of puny side, but made up with that for that with bravery. But once they found his body, it was very, very clear he did have some pretty severe scoliosis.
Playing prominent roles in the battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury at the age of just 18. The later clash was a major victory for the Yorkists. The Lancastrian Prince Edward, not to be confused with Richard's older brother, the Yorkist King Edward.
Yeah, Prince Edward is actually the only son of Henry VI.
Fourth,
basically everybody was named Edward, George, Henry, and Richard during this time, at least all the males.
Was killed, and soon afterward, Henry VI, then being held prisoner by the Yorkists in the Tower of London, was also murdered. Later accounts claim Richard and his brother George killed Prince Edward after he had surrendered, and that Richard was also behind the death of Henry VI.
Yeah, it's pretty clear, I think most people agree that Henry VI was murdered in the Tower after the Battle of Tewkesbury, after his son was killed. At this point, the Wars of the Roses have been going on, and even though Edward IV had been on the throne for a good 10 years, he gets temporarily replaced again by Henry VI. And so that time they're not taking any chances. They're going to eliminate the threat.
Oh, those are likely exaggerations. The most contemporaneous accounts of Henry's death, for example, has Richard as just one of a number of prominent figures present. Though, on the flip side, the Yorkists claim Henry had died from despair, which seems a bit too convenient if you ask me. Regardless, it seemed as though...
If you look back through history, nobody wants a serious threat to their rule. That's why Richard II is offed after he is usurped. It's why Edward II was offed after he was usurped. It's why Lady Jane Grey eventually gets executed. It's why Henry Tudor is going to have people like Perkin Warbeck executed for claiming to be an heir to the throne. Nobody can stand having someone there that could potentially be a threat to their rule. Mary Queen of Scots under Elizabeth I, same thing.
The Yorkists had triumphed. But peace and stability were not the ways of the House of York. Richard worked hard to secure his power base, claiming fortified Lancastrian lands. Then in 1472, he married Anne Neville, the daughter of the powerful Earl of Warwick.
The Kingmaker.
Warwick was an important figure in the conflict, nicknamed the Kingmaker, who changed sides multiple times before finally dying in battle.
Now, so he finally... one of the reasons he gets upset, maybe they're going to say this. No, they don't. So one of the things that really turns the Earl of Warwick off is that he is trying really hard to support Edward IV and arrange a powerful foreign alliance by marriage for Edward IV. And Edward IV goes and marries the widow of a Lancastrian, who's an English kind of somewhat noble woman, but really not anything special. She's really, you could probably argue she was a commoner. And that really irks the Earl of Warwick. And eventually that leads to his downfall. He turns to the other side, ends up being killed afterwards.
Had previously been married to the Lancastrian Prince Edward, but with both her father and husband slain by the Yorkists, she was remarried to Richard in spite of the fact they were first cousins. Also, Anne's older sister Isabel was married to Richard's older brother George, and this soon led to further family friction. Because George could not fully inherit the Earl of Warwick's lands due to Richard's marriage to Anne, and Edward IV had to step in to settle the dispute between his younger brothers by dividing the estates between them.
And George is the Duke of Clarence, and he's not long for the world at this point.
A fractious individual, George ultimately began agitating against Edward IV, and was eventually accused of treason and executed in the Tower of London.
And
Richard, consequently, moved up the ladder of royal inheritance, though it should be pointed out that George had needed no help when it came to antagonizing Edward.
And now, George is not a stable individual, I don't think. And Duke of Clarence, there are rumors, but probably unsubstantiated, that he was drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine. But you know, his own brother did participate in the charges against him. His brother, the king. So you know, I mean, his brother was the king, and he was a duke, and he was tried for treason and executed. It was a big deal at the time. But that's how terrible George's actions had been toward his own brother. A lot of these stories, they get embellished because they make for good stories, right? So. It wasn't enough that Edward II died, for example. There had to be a story that they shoved a red-hot poker in his anus, and that's how he was killed, because he was rumored to be gay. Almost certainly did not happen that way, but those kinds of stories would come about.
Claims that Richard was intimately involved in turning his two older brothers against one another are likely embellished. Nevertheless, by the early 1480s, Richard was, undisputably, the second most powerful man in England. And then, in 1483, the most powerful man in England, Edward IV, died.
But the most powerful man in England had done a lot to raise the power and influence of his wife's family, particularly the Earl of Rivers, who is first his father-in-law and then his brother-in-law, and a lot of Elizabeth Woodville's family. The Woodvilles are going to be very influential, and they're going to try to wield that influence over the new king, which is going to lead to the conflict with Richard.
Suddenly, but from natural causes. Probably. Though Edward IV had a son, yet another Edward, surprisingly. But given Eddie V was only 12 years old, Richard was declared Lord Protector, responsible for overseeing the kingdom until Edward's formal coronation. Up that ladder, Richard once again climbed. Edward V's mother, the Dowager Queen Elizabeth Woodville, urged the Royal Council to have Edward crowned immediately and remove Richard as Lord Protector. Unsurprisingly, however, Richard shut that down right quick. He seized Edward, and at the same time, had the young king's half-brother and uncle arrested and later executed. Despite this, he professed loyalty to Edward, and with the Woodvilles now outmaneuvered, the council recognized Richard as Lord Protector.
So when they talk about the young king's half-brother, they're talking about an older brother that was not one of Edward IV's sons. This is one of his brothers from Elizabeth Woodville's first marriage. She had children from her first marriage to a Lancastrian who had died during the Wars of the Roses. So this is who we're talking about there. And that's what this really boils down to, is that Richard's move to usurp power and the throne stems from his rivalry with the Woodvilles.
Richard swiftly consolidated his new position. He postponed Edward's coronation and had one of Edward's close allies, Baron Hastings, accused of treason and executed, despite the fact Hastings had previously backed Richard against the Woodvilles.
He pretty much had him hauled out in the middle of a meeting and beheaded in the courtyard. It was like crazy quick.
He also had Edward's younger brother, another Richard, seized under pretense that he was hosting him ahead of Edward's new coronation date. Then he just postponed the coronation indefinitely.
Yep.
On June 22nd, 1483, a senior theologian preached at a sermon in London claiming that Edward V was not the king's true son, and that Richard was in fact the legitimate heir of Edward IV.
The claim wasn't that he wasn't Edward IV's son. It's that he was an illegitimate child because Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid. And there's probably some truth to this under the rules as they existed, but let me see if they get into this at all.
Richard's allies petitioned him to claim the throne, and Parliament formally declared both Edward V and his younger brother illegitimate. Then,
Okay, so what happened is that Edward IV was a bit of a playboy. He was a lot of a playboy. And he was known at times to make promises to women to get them into bed. This is before he was married to Elizabeth Woodville. And the argument was that this woman, Eleanor Butler, had been formally betrothed to the future Edward IV. And at that time, just as in like biblical times where you have the story of Jesus' parents, Mary and Joseph, being betrothed. And you see that in that, even though they weren't married, it says that Joseph had in his mind to divorce Mary quietly when he found out she was pregnant with Jesus. Why would he need a divorce if they weren't married yet? Well, betrothal was a legal binding agreement. And it meant you needed a divorce to separate it, even though you weren't married and hadn't consummated it yet. So all of that is to say that the argument was that because the future Edward IV made this betrothal to Eleanor Butler, he couldn't legally have married Elizabeth Woodville, and therefore any children that they had were illegitimate. And that was his basis for claiming the throne.
June 26th, Richard accepted the crown. His position secured by...
It should be noted here that his older brother George did have a living son at this point, and that son's going to actually end up being executed later under Henry Tudor. But because there was an act of attainder against George, it meant that his heirs weren't legally allowed to inherit. So that's how Richard becomes next in line to the throne.
An army of supporters encamped near London. Thus began the reign of King Richard III. His time at the top of the ladder unfolded as it had started. A number of Yorkists, loyal to Edward, rebelled, igniting a civil war within a civil war. But they failed to rescue the captive Edward from the Tower of London. Then, sometime in the summer of 1483, both Edward and his younger brother vanished.
Yep.
The disappearances of the princes in the Tower remain one of the most sensational mysteries in English history. Of course, theories about their fate abound and could fill a whole episode alone, but generally they fall into two camps. The princes were either killed or they were freed and lived out their lives under false identities.
And you'll see lots of movies and TV shows that play out both of those things, right? There is potentially an opportunity for answers, but it would involve King Charles III making a decision. About 100, was it 100? I guess it was about 200 years after these events. Some workmen were working on the White Tower, which is like the big central keep of the Tower of London, and they found the bones, what appeared to be the bones of two boys under the stairs. Those bones are now in Westminster Abbey in an urn. They're actually in the same room as Queen Elizabeth I and Queen Mary. And they are labeled as being the bones of King Edward V and Richard, his brother. And so we have those, and we could potentially do DNA testing on those because we have the DNA now of that line because of Richard III. We could test it against his DNA and see if he's an uncle to the bones. But it would require King Charles to give permission.
Among those who believe the former, opinions differ on the perpetrator. Some have proposed the Duke of Buckingham, initially an ally of Richard, might have slain the princes on his own initiative. Around this time, Richard and Buckingham were known to have had a fierce argument about an undisclosed matter.
I am one of those people who is of the opinion that Buckingham was responsible for this. The question is, did Richard know about it? Did he do it for Richard? Did he do it for Henry Tudor to get a couple of potential claimants out of the way, or did he do it completely on his own? But I think that he's probably the one responsible.
Some claim Richard was furious that Buckingham had killed the pair. Then Buckingham joined the rebellion against Richard, becoming its figurehead before he was himself captured and executed a few months later. Ultimately, though, the most obvious suspect is Richard. As even a rookie detective knows, one of the first questions to ask is who benefits from a crime? Yeah, in this case, that's definitely Richard. Edward and his brother could have been used as pawns in the rebellion against him, and once Edward grew up, he might have fought to reclaim his throne.
And that's all very legitimate, and it absolutely is a damning argument against Richard III. Whether that's what happened.
So, tying up loose ends by eliminating Edward makes perfect sense. Still, do we have hard evidence that Richard ordered the killings? No. But not having confirmation on this particular dirty deed does not get Richard off the tyrant hook.
True.
As a usurper of the throne, who forced unnatural change on his subjects, he fits the period's definition of the word tyrant. Historian A.J. Pollard has pointed out that following the 1483 uprising, Richard replaced the gentry of many of England's rebellious southern regions with northerners loyal to him.
But by that argument, is not Henry Tudor also a tyrant? He usurped the throne, though he had a really, really tenuous claim to it. It was a really poor claim, honestly. His real claim was by right of conquest. And then he immediately marries Elizabeth Woodville's daughter, who's the younger sister of the princes in the Tower, to help give himself legitimacy. He starts replacing people with those that are loyal to him. I mean, all the same arguments could be made about Henry Tudor.
Additionally, the aristocracy of a given area had ancestral ties to the land, so transplanting them was seen as unnatural by Southerners. Conversely, Northerners viewed their new acquisitions as just rewards for their loyalty. Pollard hypothesizes that part of the reason for this sharp divide of opinions on Richard stems from this north-south divide. So even if Richard didn't kill the princes, there was plenty reason for him to be disliked.
Yeah.
But regardless of whether he killed his nephews or not, Richard would not outlive them for very long. The Lancastrian rose still had its thorns, you see. And in August 1485, Henry Tudor, exiled son of Henry VI's half-brother, landed in Wales with an army.
So Henry VI's half-brother, this is a fascinating one. Henry VI is the son of Henry V and Catherine of Valois, who was the daughter of the King of France. And that's probably where Henry VI inherited his madness, and maybe where Henry VIII inherited his madness. It ran in that family. But Catherine of Valois ends up in a relationship with this guy named Tudor and has several children with him. And eventually that's where you're going to get the line that Henry Tudor is going to be born into. He's born to a 13-year-old mother who never has another child despite being married several more times. His mother is also descended from Edward III through an illegitimate line. So you've got a whole lot of like illegitimacy and weak claims. And honestly, Henry Tudor's only real claim is that he's pretty much the only Lancastrian left standing, even though he's really not much of one.
Henry had the backing of the French and possibly the Scots. He had also been born in Wales, traditionally a stronghold for the Lancastrian faction.
The Tudor name itself was a Welsh name.
He was soon marching on England with a formidable force. So Richard raised his own host and moved to meet the threat. The two sides clashing near Ambion Hill, close to the town of Bosworth, as we talked about at the beginning of this episode. At the height of the fighting, Richard boldly charged at Henry and was said to have come within a sword's length of his rival.
Yeah, I mean, Richard sees Henry Tudor. He thinks he's got a chance to end this because if Henry Tudor's dead, the rest of the people have nothing to fight for. So he's going to end it and just be done with it. And you cannot say, you can say a lot of things about Richard III. You cannot say he wasn't brave. He was incredibly brave. He was known to be a warrior on the battlefield, and he charges right at his enemy. He kills William Brandon, who is Henry Tudor's standard bearer, which would have been right next to him. He's the father of the guy who will one day be one of Henry VIII's closest friends, Charles Brandon, played by Henry Cavill, if you've ever seen The Tudors. His father was personally killed by Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth.
Yet just as the two nearly met, a third force under Lord Stanley, who had played both sides, slammed into the combat.
It didn't hurt that Stanley was married to Henry Tudor's mom.
In the end, he'd chosen to back Henry and broke Richard's retinue. Richard was surrounded and cut down. It appears his helmet was lost or dragged off, and later analysis of his remains postulated there were 4 dagger stabs, 1 sword stroke, and 1 halberd strike to his head.
Yeah, the halberd strike takes off the back of his head. This is all covered. If you watch the extensive documentary that's on YouTube about this, they go over all the wounds and exactly what happened before he was dead, what happened after he was dead. We learned a lot from his body. We really did.
Lancastrians displayed Richard's naked corpse in Leicester before hurriedly burying it. Though incredibly, Richard, already a larger-than-life historical figure, mind you, was rediscovered in 2012 in what had become a car park for Leicester Social Services. In 2015, the bones were buried with ceremony in Leicester Cathedral.
Attended, among others, by Prince Richard, the current Duke of Gloucester, who Richard, before he became Richard III, was the Duke of Gloucester.
Despite a legal challenge from some who believed he should be laid to rest in York Cathedral. The judge ruling on the case recommended they settle out of court, however, to, quote, avoid embarking on the Wars of the Roses Part 2. All right, so where does this leave us? Can we ever get in among the weeds and untangle this rose bush? By golly, we're gonna try. Final post-mortem report. Richard has many defenders, and it's true that the worst depictions of him are little more than caricatures based on 16th century writers.
100%. I mean, there were plenty of people when he was king who liked him, who thought he was a noble man, who thought he was just and kind. And you can look at the actions that he took with 21st century eyes and think despicable, horrible, evil, right? But if you look at them in their context, they're not altogether unusual for a monarch at that time, especially one who was dealing with the embers of civil war. Yes, killing his nephews is especially heinous, but hardly the first time that something like that happened. Honestly, I don't think he was any better or any worse than other monarchs of his era.
By the victorious Henry
the usurping part, yeah.
Tudor and his descendants. The most influential was, of course, Shakespeare. For example, consider Richard's spinal scoliosis. While Richard did have the condition, it was barely remarked upon by contemporaries and doesn't appear to have impeded him. But Shakespeare made it...
It wouldn't have been incredibly noticeable when he was wearing clothing, or especially when he was wearing armor. When he had a shirt off, you would definitely have been able to tell. And yeah, there would have been like a slight upturn on one shoulder, but he wasn't a hunchback.
One of Richard's defining characteristics, suggesting the outward physical disability reflected a disfigured inner soul. Okay, but even if we dismiss this Tudor propaganda, we can go a little further. Good deeds and virtuous characteristics can certainly be ascribed to Richard. He provided pensions to the widows of Lancastrian and rebel leaders he killed, gave to the poor, conducted various legal reforms, such as ending the requirement for certain subjects to grant the king loans on demand, and appears to have genuinely been concerned with commoners' welfare. Bishop Thomas Langston wrote in 1483, "Many a poor man that has suffered wrong many days has been relieved and helped by him." Yet, that does not override Richard's cutthroat rise to power. Whether it's his involvement in the murder of Henry VI, his failure to stand with his brother George when he was accused of treason.
I'm not going to ascribe those things to him as marks of a tyrant. Henry VI being eliminated was par for the course, as I've said before. That is exactly what you do in that situation. George, the Duke of Clarence, was clearly guilty of treason, so he wouldn't have stood by him, because standing by him would have been to stand against his other brother, who was the king.
His decision to turn on and execute allies, or most infamously, his potential involvement in the disappearance of the princes. Richard didn't so much climb the rungs of power as scale a mound of corpses to briefly clutch at the crown. While it is uncertain that he is guilty of all of these crimes, it really is undeniable that he had a hand in at least some. The question of whether Richard III was a tyrant will undoubtedly continue. For now, though, perhaps we should give the final word to a number of prominent Londoners who gathered in 1525 to reject Henry VIII's demand for a loan. The basis of their refusal? Richard had banned the need to provide such loans to the king.
And Richard III is Henry VIII's great uncle, right? I mean, his mother was Elizabeth of York. She was the younger sister to the princes in the Tower. His grandfather, Henry VIII's grandfather, was Edward IV, Richard's brother.
Henry's Lord Chancellor scoffed at the man he described as a usurper and murderer of his own nephews. The Londoners responded that although Richard did evil, yet in his time were many good acts made. AKA, some TSI cases are never meant to be truly solved. End recording.
All right, that was good. I love talking about this topic, so I'm going to put some links down in the description to some other videos related to the Wars of the Roses and this topic, so you can dive into it a little more if you want to. Put some up on the screen here at the end as well. Thanks for watching.